The rain fell in heavy sheets across the parking lot of the Monroe County Sheriff's Department, each drop catching the pale yellow glow of the security lights before disappearing into the asphalt. Inside, behind a door marked with faded gold letters, Detective Marcus Cole sat across from Captain Richard Brennan, the weight of a manila folder between them like a loaded weapon. Marcus had been with the department for 12 years. 12 years of early mornings and late nights. 12 years of missed birthdays and hollow promises to his wife Elena that next month would be different. His face carried the map of those years, lines around his eyes that deepened when he smiled, which was less often now than before. His hands, rough from years of work, rested on his knees as he listened to what the captain was proposing. The folder contained photographs, men on motorcycles, a clubhouse with a faded sign, names and dates and locations that painted a picture of something the department had been watching for 18 months. The Iron Wolves Motorcycle Club operated out of a small town called Ridgeway, about 40 miles north of the city. Population 3,000, one traffic light, and a reputation that made neighboring counties nervous. Captain Brennan leaned forward, his chair creaking under the shift of his weight. The fluorescent light above them flickered once, casting brief shadows across his weathered face. He had been in law enforcement for 31 years, and every one of those years had etched itself into the lines around his mouth, the gray at his temples, the careful way he chose his words. The Iron Wolves were suspected of running protection operations across 3 counties. Local businesses had filed complaints, anonymous ones, always anonymous, about payments demanded in exchange for safety. There were whispers of intimidation, of threats delivered in parking lots and diners, of a network that operated just beneath the surface of small-town life like roots beneath soil. But whispers were not evidence. Anonymous complaints did not hold up in court. The department needed someone on the inside, someone who could document, observe, and report. Someone who could become one of them long enough to understand how they operated, and then bring that understanding back to the light. Marcus listened without interrupting. The rain continued its steady rhythm against the window, a percussion that seemed to underscore the gravity of what was being asked. His mind wandered briefly to Elena at home, probably reading in the living room, a cup of tea growing cold beside her, waiting for him to walk through the door. She had stopped asking when he would be home. That was perhaps the saddest part of their marriage now. Not the arguments, but the absence of them. The quiet acceptance that his work came first. The assignment would require him to disappear. Not literally, but socially. He would take a leave of absence. He would grow out his hair, let his beard fill in, adopt the appearance of a man who had walked away from conventional life. He would move to Ridgeway under a fabricated identity. Marcus Reed, a mechanic from Toledo who had left behind a failed marriage and a job that went nowhere. A man looking for something different. A man looking for belonging. Captain Brennan slid a photograph across the desk. It showed a man in his 50s, silver hair pulled back in a ponytail, arms covered in tattoos that told stories Marcus could not yet read. His name was Victor Harlan, and he was the president of the Iron Wolves. He had founded the club 23 years ago, after returning from military service overseas. The club had started as a group of veterans, men who had served together, who had seen things together, who needed the company of others who understood what it meant to carry invisible weight. Over the years, the club had grown. New members joined who had not served. The original purpose, brotherhood, support, camaraderie, had evolved into something more complicated, or so the department believed. The truth, Captain Brennan admitted, was that they did not know exactly what the Iron Wolves were. That was why they needed Marcus. The detective picked up the photograph, studying the face of Victor Harlan. There was something in the man's eyes that the camera had captured. Not cruelty, not coldness, but a kind of measured intensity. The look of someone who had made peace with difficult decisions. the look of someone who had led men through circumstances that most people would never understand. Marcus set the photograph down. He asked how long the assignment would last. Captain Brennan said it depended on how quickly Marcus could gain their trust. Could be 6 months. Could be a year. Could be longer. There were no guarantees in undercover work, only patience, observation, and the slow accumulation of truth. The detective thought about Elena. He thought about the small house they had bought together 7 years ago, the garden she tended with such care, the way she still reached for his hand sometimes when they walked together on Sunday mornings. He thought about how far apart they had grown, and how this assignment would push them further still. He thought about the oath he had taken when he joined the department, to protect and serve, to uphold the law, to stand between the innocent and those who would harm them. He said yes. The weeks that followed were a transformation. Marcus stopped shaving. He let his hair grow past his collar, then past his shoulders. He traded his pressed shirts for flannel and denim, his polished shoes for worn boots. He spent hours in the department's garage working on an old motorcycle they had seized years ago, learning its engine the way a musician learns an instrument. He read everything he could find about motorcycle culture, the history, the codes, the unwritten rules that governed life on 2 wheels. Elena watched these changes with a mixture of confusion and resignation. He could not tell her the truth. Operational security demanded silence. So he told her half-truths instead. A special assignment, something that required a different appearance, something that would take him away for a while. She listened, nodded, and returned to her book. The distance between them grew wider with each passing day, and Marcus told himself it was necessary, told himself it was temporary, told himself that when this was over, he would find his way back to her. On a Thursday morning in late September, Marcus Cole became Marcus Reed. He packed a single bag, strapped it to the back of his motorcycle, and rode north toward Ridgeway. The city fell away behind him, replaced by open fields and small towns and roads that curved through hills painted with the first colors of autumn. The wind pressed against his chest, carrying the smell of fallen leaves and distant rain, and for a moment, just a moment, he felt something he had not felt in years. Freedom. Possibility. The open road stretching out before him like a promise. Ridgeway appeared gradually the way small towns do, a water tower first, then a church steeple, then the main street with its hardware store and diner and single traffic light swaying in the breeze. Marcus pulled his motorcycle to a stop outside a bar called the Rusty Nail, killed the engine, and sat for a moment in the sudden silence. This was where it would begin. This was where Marcus Cole would disappear, and Marcus Reed would take his first breath. He climbed off the bike, adjusted his jacket, and walked inside. The interior was dim, lit by neon signs advertising beers that had been popular decades ago. A pool table occupied one corner, its green felt worn smooth by years of use. The bar itself was a long stretch of scarred wood, tended by a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and tired hands. 3 men sat at a table near the window, their leather vests identifying them as members of the Iron Wolves. They looked up when Marcus entered, studied him with the careful attention of men who noticed everything, then returned to their conversation. Marcus took a seat at the bar. He ordered a beer. He waited. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel. Stories like this one, stories of courage, identity, and the search for truth, are what we share here every week. If you believe that the most powerful journeys are the ones that change who we are, then join us. Subscribe now and never miss a chapter. The first month in Ridgeway was an exercise in patience. Marcus rented a small apartment above the hardware store, a single room with a mattress on the floor and a window that overlooked the main street. He found work at a garage on the edge of town, a place run by an old mechanic named Earl, who asked few questions and paid in cash. The work was honest. Oil changes, brake repairs, the occasional engine rebuild. And it gave Marcus a reason to be in Ridgeway that anyone could understand. He saw the iron wolves everywhere. They gathered at the Rusty Nail most evenings, their motorcycles lined up outside like a chrome parade. They ate breakfast at the diner on Saturday mornings, filling the largest booth with laughter and conversation that stopped whenever a stranger walked past. They held court in the town square, their presence a kind of gravity that pulled attention wherever they went. But they did not approach Marcus. He was an outsider, and outsiders were observed before they were acknowledged. This was a world with its own rules, its own rhythms, and Marcus understood that he could not rush the process. Trust was earned, not demanded. Respect was built through consistency, not claims. So he waited. He worked at the garage. He drank his beer at the Rusty Nail, always at the same seat, always alone. He nodded politely when he passed members of the club on the street, but he did not try to initiate conversation. He let himself be seen, let himself become familiar, let the town grow accustomed to the quiet mechanic from Toledo who kept to himself and caused no trouble. Elena called once a week. Their conversations were brief, careful, full of silences that said more than words. She asked when he was coming home. He said soon. She asked if he was safe. He said yes. She asked if he still loved her. He paused for too long before answering, and the pause itself became a kind of answer. They said goodbye, and Marcus sat in his small apartment, staring at the phone, wondering if he was losing her by inches or all at once. The break came unexpectedly, as most breaks do. Marcus was working late at the garage one evening, replacing a transmission in an old pickup truck, when a motorcycle pulled into the lot. He recognized the rider immediately, a man named Danny Torres, one of the younger members of the Iron Wolves. Danny was in his late 20s, with a quick smile and nervous energy that set him apart from the older, more measured members of the club. The motorcycle was making a sound that no healthy engine should make. A grinding, coughing protest that suggested something had gone seriously wrong somewhere in its mechanical heart. Danny killed the engine and climbed off, frustration written across his face. He looked at Marcus, then at the garage, then back at Marcus. There was a moment of calculation. Danny did not know this mechanic, had no reason to trust him, but the motorcycle needed help, and the garage was right there, and sometimes necessity overcomes caution. Danny asked if Marcus could take a look. Marcus wiped his hands on a rag, walked over to the motorcycle, and listened as Danny described the problem. A sudden loss of power, a strange noise, a feeling that something was broken deep inside the machine. Marcus nodded, knelt beside the bike, and began his examination. The problem was the clutch, a worn component that had finally given up its long fight against friction and time. Marcus explained what he had found, described what would need to be replaced, and quoted a price that was lower than what any shop in the city would charge. Danny looked at him with surprise, then gratitude, then something that might have been the first glimmer of respect. Over the next few days, Marcus worked on Danny's motorcycle. He ordered the parts from a supplier in the city, installed them with the care of someone who understood that a machine was more than metal. It was trust, it was freedom, it was the only thing standing between a rider and the road. When the work was finished, Danny sat on the repaired bike, started the engine, and listened to it purr with renewed life. He reached for his wallet, but Marcus waved him off. "No charge," he said. "Consider it a favor between neighbors." Danny studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. He asked Marcus where he had learned to work on bikes like that. Marcus told him the truth, or a version of it. He had been a mechanic in Toledo, had worked on motorcycles for years, had come to Ridgeway because he needed a fresh start, a new road, a place where nobody knew his name. Danny listened, then invited Marcus to the Rusty Nail that evening. Not an official invitation. Danny did not have the authority to speak for the club, but a friendly suggestion. A chance to have a beer with someone who understood machines the way Danny did. Marcus accepted. That evening, he walked into the Rusty Nail and found Danny waiting at the bar. They drank together, talked about motorcycles and engines and the roads that connected small towns across the country like stitches in a quilt. Other members of the Iron Wolves drifted in and out of the conversation. Casual introductions, brief handshakes, the careful assessment of a potential new face. Victor Harlan arrived late in the evening. The president of the Iron Wolves moved through the bar with the quiet authority of someone who did not need to raise his voice to be heard. He paused at the bar, ordered a whiskey, and turned to look at Marcus. The two men studied each other for a long moment, cop and club president, truth and cover story, two worlds colliding in the dim light of a small-town bar. Victor asked Marcus his name, asked where he was from, asked what had brought him to Ridgeway. The questions were simple, but the way Victor asked them carried weight. He was not making conversation. He was conducting an interview. Marcus answered carefully, sticking to his cover story, the failed marriage, the dead-end job, the need for something different. Victor listened without interruption, his eyes never leaving Marcus's face. When the story was finished, Victor nodded once, slowly, as if filing the information away for later consideration. Then he did something Marcus had not expected. He reached out and shook Marcus's hand. "Welcome to Ridgeway," he said. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of something larger, an acknowledgement, an opening. A door that had been closed now standing slightly ajar. Marcus shook Victor's hand, felt the calluses and the strength in the older man's grip, and understood that he had just passed the first test. There would be others, many others. But for now, he was no longer invisible. He was no longer just the mechanic from Toledo. He was beginning to become one of them. Winter arrived in Ridgeway with a suddenness that caught Marcus off guard. One week the leaves were still falling, painting the streets in shades of amber and rust, and the next week the first snow was drifting down from a gray sky, blanketing the town in white silence. The cold seeped into everything, the walls of his apartment, the engine of his motorcycle, the spaces between words in his weekly calls with Elena. The Iron Wolves did not slow down with the weather. If anything, they drew closer together, spending more time at the clubhouse on the edge of town, a converted warehouse that had been transformed over the years into something between a home and a fortress. Marcus had been inside twice now, once for a casual gathering, once for a meeting that had included potential new members. He was not yet a full member of the club, but he had progressed from outsider to prospect, a status that came with responsibilities and restrictions and the constant awareness that he was being watched. The prospect period was a test. Danny had explained it to him one evening, over beers in the clubhouse, the warmth of a wood stove fighting against the cold that pressed against the windows. Prospects did the work that full members did not want to do, cleaning the clubhouse, running errands, standing guard at events. It was a way of proving commitment, of demonstrating that you understood the club was not something you joined for convenience. It was a way of life. Marcus accepted the role with the patience that undercover work demanded. He cleaned. He ran errands. He stood in the cold outside the clubhouse while meetings happened inside, stamping his feet to keep warm, watching his breath form clouds in the winter air. He learned the names and faces of every member, memorized their habits and preferences, noted who arrived early and who left late, and who seemed to hold influence beyond their official rank. And slowly, gradually, he began to understand something that the department had not anticipated. The Iron Wolves were not what he had expected. The complaints that had prompted this investigation, the whispers of protection money and intimidation, existed, but they were not what Marcus had been led to believe. The payments that local businesses made to the club were voluntary, offered in exchange for actual services. Security at events, escorts for deliveries through dangerous areas, a visible presence that deterred the kind of trouble that small towns sometimes attracted from outsiders. The intimidation that had been reported was not directed at innocent citizens, but at those who threatened the community, dealers who tried to sell harmful substances near the school, predators who circled the edges of town looking for vulnerable targets. The Iron Wolves were not criminals. They were protectors. This realization settled into Marcus's chest like a stone, heavy and uncomfortable and impossible to ignore. He lay awake at night in his small apartment, staring at the ceiling, trying to reconcile what he was seeing with what he had been told. Captain Brennan had described the club as a threat. The department's files painted a picture of organized intimidation and illegal activity. But the reality Marcus witnessed every day was different. A brotherhood of men who looked after each other and their community, who operated outside the law not because they rejected justice, but because they had seen how often the law failed to provide it. Victor Harlan became the focus of Marcus's attention. The club president was a study in contradictions. Rough exterior, gentle manner, iron will wrapped in quiet patience. He had served 3 tours overseas, had seen things that he never discussed, had returned to a country that did not understand what he had been through. The Iron Wolves had been his answer to the question of what came next. A family of choice. A purpose that gave meaning to the skills he had acquired in service. One evening, during a rare moment alone with Victor, Marcus found himself asking questions that went beyond his cover story. He asked about the club's history, about its founding, about what had driven Victor to create something from nothing. The older man studied him for a long moment, as if deciding how much truth to offer, then began to speak. The story unfolded slowly, like a river finding its way through unfamiliar terrain. Victor had returned from war broken in ways that did not show on the surface. He had tried to reintegrate into civilian life, a job, an apartment, the routines that normal people took for granted. But nothing fit. He felt disconnected, adrift, haunted by memories that ambushed him at unexpected moments. He had watched friends from his unit struggle with the same demons, watched some of them lose the battle, watched the system that was supposed to help them fail again and again. The Iron Wolves had started as a support group, a handful of veterans who met weekly to ride together, to share meals, to remind each other that they were not alone. The motorcycles were therapy, the focus required to ride, the freedom of the open road, the brotherhood of men who understood each other without needing words. Over time, the group had grown, had formalized, had adopted the structure and symbols of a motorcycle club. But the core purpose had never changed. They took care of each other, and they took care of their community. Marcus listened, and something shifted inside him. The certainty he had carried into this assignment, the clear line between law and lawlessness, between right and wrong, began to blur. These were not the villains he had been sent to expose. These were men who had been failed by the institutions that should have supported them, who had built something meaningful from the ruins of that failure. The weight of his deception pressed down on him with new intensity. Every handshake, every shared meal, every moment of genuine connection, it was all built on a lie. He was not Marcus Reed, the mechanic from Toledo seeking a fresh start. He was Marcus Cole, detective, sent here to gather evidence that would be used to tear this brotherhood apart. That night, he called Elena. The conversation was different from their usual exchanges. Longer, more personal, filled with the things he could not say directly. He told her he missed her. Told her he was sorry for all the distance, all the silence, all the ways he had chosen his work over their life together. She listened, and when she spoke, her voice was softer than it had been in months. She asked if something had changed. He said yes, but he could not explain how. She asked if he was coming home soon. He said he did not know. She asked if he still believed in what he was doing. The question hung in the air between them, suspended in the static of the phone connection, waiting for an answer he could not give. He said he loved her. She said she loved him too. But love, they both understood, was not always enough to bridge the distance that life created. Sometimes love was a bridge, and sometimes it was just a memory of a bridge that had already burned. In the clubhouse, surrounded by men who had welcomed him into their family, Marcus felt more alone than he had ever felt in his life. The truth was a weight he could not share, a secret that poisoned every connection he made. He was living two lives, and both of them were slowly tearing him apart. If this moment resonates with you, if you understand what it feels like to be caught between who you are and who you are supposed to be, then pause right now and leave a comment. Tell me. I know what it means to carry a secret. Those words will connect you to thousands of others who understand. You are not alone. Spring arrived in Ridgeway like a resurrection. The snow melted, revealing the dormant grass beneath. Trees that had stood bare for months began to show the first signs of green life. The roads, finally free of ice, called to riders who had spent the winter waiting. And the Iron Wolves answered that call with a run. 3 days of riding through the hills and valleys of the surrounding country, a celebration of the season and the brotherhood. Marcus had been a prospect for 4 months. The test of his commitment was about to reach its final phase. The run began on a Friday morning, the clubhouse parking lot filled with the rumble of engines and the sound of men greeting each other with the easy familiarity of family. Marcus had prepared his motorcycle carefully, checking every component, ensuring that nothing would fail on the long miles ahead. He strapped his bag to the back, pulled on his helmet, and took his place in the formation, near the back, as befitting a prospect, but part of the group nonetheless. They rode north, following roads that wound through forests, still waking from winter's sleep. The air was cool but not cold, carrying the scent of pine and new growth. Marcus felt the rhythm of the ride settle into his bones, the focus required to navigate, the awareness of the riders around him, the sense of moving through the world as part of something larger than himself. The first night, they stopped at a campground that the club had used for years. Tents were erected, a fire was built, and the evening unfolded with the rituals that defined the brotherhood. Stories shared over flames, bottles passed from hand to hand, laughter that echoed through the trees. Marcus sat among them, listening, laughing, feeling the warmth of acceptance even as the cold of his deception never fully left his chest. Victor found him late in the evening, after most of the others had retreated to their tents. The club president sat down beside the fire, staring into the flames with the distant look of a man who had spent many nights like this, in places far from home. They sat in silence for a long time. Then Victor began to speak. He talked about the early days of the club, when it had been just a handful of broken men trying to find their way. He talked about the members they had lost over the years, to illness, to accidents, to the demons that some could not outrun. He talked about what the club meant to him, why he had dedicated his life to building and maintaining it, what he hoped it would become long after he was gone. Then he asked Marcus a question. A simple question, delivered with the quiet intensity that characterized everything Victor did. Why are you really here? The words landed like stones in still water, sending ripples through the silence between them. Marcus felt his heart rate increase, felt the training he had received kick in, felt the cover story rising to his lips as it had 100 times before. But something stopped him. He looked at Victor, at the lines on the man's face, the gray in his hair, the decades of experience and pain and wisdom that had shaped him into who he was. He thought about the brotherhood he had witnessed, the genuine care these men had for each other and their community. He thought about the lie he was living, the harm he was poised to cause, the cost of the truth he was hiding. And he made a decision. Marcus told Victor everything. He told him about the department, about the investigation, about the assignment that had brought him to Ridgeway. He told him about the evidence he had been sent to gather, the case the department was trying to build, the charges they hoped to file. He laid out every detail, every instruction, every piece of the operation that had defined his life for the past months. When he finished, the silence between them was absolute. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks into the darkness. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called out, its voice lonely and ancient. Victor did not move, did not speak. His face remained unreadable, a mask that revealed nothing of what was happening beneath the surface. Then, slowly, he nodded. The conversation that followed lasted until dawn. Victor asked questions, and Marcus answered them honestly. The first honest answers he had given since arriving in Ridgeway. They discussed the department's suspicions, the complaints that had triggered the investigation, the gap between what law enforcement believed and what was actually true. By the time the sun began to lighten the eastern sky, something had shifted. Marcus had expected anger, betrayal, perhaps even violence. Instead, he found understanding. Victor was not naive. He knew that the club's activities existed in a gray area, that their methods of protecting the community sometimes crossed lines that the law had drawn. But he also knew that the law, as it was enforced, often failed the very people it was supposed to protect. Victor proposed a solution. The club would open its books, metaphorically and literally, to Marcus. They would show him everything, answer every question, provide documentation that could prove their activities were not what the department believed. In exchange, Marcus would present this truth to his superiors. He would advocate for the club, use his position to correct the misunderstanding that had brought him here. It was a risk for both of them. Victor was trusting a man who had spent months deceiving him. Marcus was betting his career, and possibly his freedom, on the hope that the department would listen. But some risks, Victor said, were worth taking. Some truths were worth fighting for. Marcus agreed. The run continued for 2 more days, but everything had changed. Marcus no longer observed from the outside, cataloging evidence for a case he now questioned. He participated fully, allowing himself to feel what he had been afraid to feel. The genuine connection, the true belonging, the brotherhood that the club offered to those who earned it. On the final night, around a fire that burned against the spring darkness, the Iron Wolves held a vote. The question was simple. Should Marcus Reed be accepted as a full member of the club? The vote was unanimous. Victor presented him with a leather vest, a cut in the language of the club, bearing the Iron Wolves emblem. Marcus put it on, feeling the weight of it settle across his shoulders, understanding that this weight was both literal and symbolic. He was no longer a prospect. He was no longer an outsider. He was, for the first time in his life, home. The drive back to the city took 3 hours. Marcus made it alone, following the same roads he had traveled months ago, but everything was different now. The landscape had not changed. The same fields, the same small towns, the same curves through hills. But he was seeing it through different eyes. Eyes that had been opened, eyes that could no longer ignore what they had seen. Captain Brennan was waiting for him at the department. The debriefing was scheduled for that afternoon, in the same conference room where the assignment had begun. Marcus entered the building still wearing the clothes he had worn in Ridgeway, still carrying the dust of the road on his boots, still feeling the leather of his cut against his back. He had left the vest at his apartment. Some things did not belong in this building. The conference room was occupied by familiar faces. Captain Brennan, the district attorney's representative, 2 agents from the State Bureau who had been monitoring the investigation from a distance. They looked at Marcus with the expectation of success, the anticipation of a case that was about to break open. Marcus sat down across from them and began to speak. He told them the truth. Not the truth they wanted to hear. The evidence of criminal enterprise, the documentation of intimidation and illegal payments. He told them the other truth. The truth about the Iron Wolves. The truth about Victor Harlan. The truth about a brotherhood of men who had been misunderstood, mislabeled, misjudged by a system that saw leather vests and motorcycles and assumed the worst. He presented the evidence he had gathered, not evidence of wrongdoing, but evidence of community protection, of veteran support, of a network that filled the gaps left by institutions that had failed. He described the payments that businesses made voluntarily in exchange for services that the law could not or would not provide. He explained the intimidation that was directed not at innocent citizens, but at those who threatened the vulnerable. The room grew quiet as he spoke. The anticipation drained from the faces around the table, replaced by confusion, then skepticism, then something that looked like anger. Captain Brennan interrupted. He reminded Marcus of his assignment, reminded him of his duty, reminded him that the department had invested significant resources into this investigation and that those resources needed to produce results. Marcus listened, then continued. He acknowledged the department's investment. He understood the pressure to produce a case, to justify the time and money that had been spent, but he could not, would not, be party to prosecuting men whose only crime was protecting their community in ways that the law had failed to do. The conversation that followed was not pleasant. Accusations were made. Integrity was questioned. The word compromised was used more than once, aimed at Marcus like a weapon. But he stood his ground. He had spent months living among the Iron Wolves, and he knew them better than anyone in this room. He knew the truth. And the truth was that there was no case to make. The meeting ended without resolution. Marcus was told to take administrative leave while the department reviewed the situation. He was escorted from the building by a colleague who could not meet his eyes. His badge and weapons surrendered at the front desk. He walked out into the afternoon sunlight, a free man but an uncertain one. He called Elena from the parking lot. She answered on the second ring, her voice cautious, as if she expected bad news. He told her he was coming home. The weeks that followed were a trial of a different kind. The department conducted its review, interviewing Marcus multiple times, examining every report he had filed, every decision he had made. The district attorney's office pushed for charges, not against the Iron Wolves but against Marcus himself. Obstruction, failure to perform duties, aiding and abetting. But the evidence did not support those charges. Marcus had done his job. He had investigated the Iron Wolves thoroughly. He had gathered extensive documentation. The fact that his findings differed from what the department expected was not a crime. It was the natural result of an investigation that had uncovered unexpected truth. The case against the Iron Wolves was quietly closed. No charges were filed. The files were sealed and archived, joining countless other investigations that had led nowhere. The department moved on to other priorities, other cases, other targets. The Iron Wolves continued their work in Ridgeway, undisturbed by the attention they had never known they were receiving. And Marcus Cole found himself at a crossroads. His career with the department was effectively over. The official review had cleared him of wrongdoing, but the unofficial judgment was less forgiving. He was marked as someone who had gone native, who had lost his objectivity, who could not be trusted with sensitive assignments. Promotion was no longer possible. His colleagues looked at him differently now, some with sympathy, others with suspicion, most with the uncomfortable awareness that he had done something they did not understand. Elena watched him struggle with this new reality. She had seen him return from Ridgeway changed, quieter, more reflective, carrying a weight that had nothing to do with physical burden. She did not ask for details. She had been married to him long enough to know that some experiences could not be explained, only processed over time. What she did notice was the way he looked at his badge now, the way he hesitated before putting on his uniform, the way his eyes drifted towards something distant whenever he thought no one was watching. One evening she asked him a simple question, a question that had no simple answer. What do you want? Marcus thought about the question for a long time. He thought about the oath he had taken 12 years ago. He thought about the work he had done, the cases he had solved, the people he had helped. He thought about the Iron Wolves, about Victor, about the brotherhood that had accepted him even after learning the truth about who he was. Then he gave his wife an honest answer. I want to belong to something that matters. The resignation letter was brief. Marcus had never been comfortable with words on paper. He preferred action, direct communication, truth spoken rather than written. But some things required documentation, and this was one of them. He submitted the letter on a Tuesday morning. Captain Brennan accepted it without comment, without argument, without any of the conversation that might have been expected. The understanding between them was unspoken but clear. This was the best outcome for everyone. Marcus would leave quietly. The department would move on. The uncomfortable questions that his investigation had raised would be allowed to fade. Elena helped him pack his things from the office. 12 years of accumulated career distilled into 2 cardboard boxes. Photographs from commendations. A coffee mug with a chip on the handle. A calendar that still showed last month's page, frozen in time like a small monument to a life that had ended. They loaded the boxes into their car and drove away from the department for the last time. Marcus watched the building shrink in the rearview mirror, feeling something he had not expected to feel. Not sadness, not regret, something more like relief. The weight he had been carrying for months, the deception, the divided loyalties, the impossible position between 2 worlds, was finally lifting. That evening, they sat together on the porch of their small house, watching the sun set over the neighborhood they had called home for 7 years. The garden that Elena had tended with such care was beginning to bloom, the first flowers of the season pushing through soil that had been cold and dormant just weeks before. Marcus told her the whole story. Everything he had not been able to say during the assignment. The Iron Wolves, Victor, the Brotherhood, the truth he had discovered and the choice he had made. He talked for hours, the words flowing out of him like water finally released from a dam. Elena listened without interruption. When he finished, she reached over and took his hand, a gesture so simple and so profound that it carried more meaning than any words could have conveyed. She asked what came next. Marcus had been thinking about that question since the day he submitted his resignation. The answer had been forming slowly, taking shape in the quiet hours of the night, in the moments between waking and sleeping when truth often revealed itself. He wanted to go back to Ridgeway, not as a detective, not as an investigator, but as himself, as Marcus Cole, a man who had found something worth belonging to, something worth building, something worth fighting for. He wanted to continue the work that the Iron Wolves had been doing, protecting their community, supporting their members, filling the gaps that institutions left unfilled. Elena studied his face as he spoke. She had seen many versions of her husband over the years. The young officer full of idealism, the experienced detective worn down by cynicism, the distant stranger who had returned from Ridgeway carrying secrets she could not share. Now she saw something new, a clarity that had been absent for longer than she could remember, a sense of purpose that lit his eyes from within. She asked if there was room in Ridgeway for her. The question surprised him. He had assumed she would want to stay. The house, the garden, the life they had built. But Elena had been doing her own thinking during the months of his absence. She had been evaluating what mattered, what was worth keeping, what was worth letting go, and she had reached her own conclusions. Their life in the city had been comfortable, but it had not been complete. She had watched Marcus become a stranger, had felt the distance between them grow with each passing year, had accepted a marriage that was more partnership than passion. The woman who had married him 12 years ago had dreamed of adventure, of meaning, of a life that mattered beyond the ordinary routines of daily existence. She wanted to find that life again. They drove to Ridgeway together, a week later, the back of their car filled with the possessions they had decided to keep. The small house was rented, the furniture sold, the garden left to grow wild until the next occupant chose to tend it. They had said goodbye to the life they had known, and now they were driving towards something uncertain but full of possibility. Victor was waiting for them at the clubhouse. Word had traveled through the network that connected the Brotherhood. Marcus was coming back, and he was bringing his wife. The welcome they received was warm, genuine, and immediate. These were people who understood loyalty, who recognized commitment when they saw it, who knew that the man standing before them had risked everything for the truth. The months that followed were a transformation for both of them. Marcus became an official member of the Iron Wolves, his law enforcement background making him valuable in ways he had not anticipated. He helped establish protocols, worked with local authorities to formalize the club's community protection services, built bridges between the Brotherhood and the institutions that had once viewed them with suspicion. Elena found her own place in Ridgeway. Her nursing background, and she had worked in hospitals before they moved, made her essential to the club's support services. She helped organize health screenings for veterans, connected members with mental health resources, became the first person many turned to when they were struggling and did not know where else to go. Together, they built a life that neither of them had imagined. A life rooted in community, in purpose, in the daily work of making things better for the people around them. The distance that had grown between them during the years in the city began to close, replaced by the intimacy of shared mission, shared purpose, shared belief in something larger than themselves. One evening, a year after they had arrived in Ridgeway, Victor called a meeting at the clubhouse. The purpose was not business. It was celebration. The club had been recognized by the county for their veteran support services. A plaque had been presented by the mayor, a woman who had once viewed the Iron Wolves with the same suspicion that the rest of the world carried. Now she stood beside Victor, shaking his hand, thanking him for what the club had built. After the ceremony, Marcus and Victor stood together on the porch of the clubhouse, watching the sun set over the hills that surrounded the town. The light was golden, painting everything in shades of warmth and possibility. Victor asked Marcus if he regretted his choice. The question carried weight. It acknowledged everything that had been sacrificed, everything that had been lost, everything that had been traded for this new life. Marcus thought about it. He thought about his career, the badge he had surrendered, the colleagues who had turned away. He thought about the case he had refused to make, the justice he had chosen not to pursue, the law he had decided not to serve. Then he thought about Elena, laughing with the other women inside the clubhouse. He thought about the veterans who had found purpose and support through the club's programs. He thought about the community that had welcomed them, the belonging they had found, the meaning that filled each day. No, he said. He did not regret it. Victor nodded, as if he had expected the answer. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the day fade into twilight. Some roads, Victor said, lead you away from where you started. Others lead you home. Marcus understood. His road had taken him through deception and truth, through loyalty divided and loyalty found, through a journey that had changed everything about who he was and what he believed. He had started as a detective sworn to uphold the law. He had become something different. A brother, a protector, a man who had learned that honor was not about wearing a badge, but about how you treated the people who depended on you. The Iron Wolves had taught him that. Victor had taught him that. And in the end, Marcus had taught himself. The story of the former cop who infiltrated a biker gang and was never the same again was not a story of betrayal. It was a story of discovery, of finding the courage to question what you had always believed, of choosing truth over convenience, of recognizing that the world was more complicated than any briefing or training could ever prepare you to understand. And it was a story of home, of finding the place where you belonged, even if that place was nothing like what you had expected. If you watch this far, it is because this story touched something inside you. It is because you understand what it means to search for belonging, to question your assumptions, to find the courage to change. Leave a comment saying I watched this far so I can get to know you, so I can know who really values the stories on this channel. You are the reason I do this. You are the brotherhood that forms around these tales. And if this story moved you, if it made you think, if it gave you something worth carrying with you, then like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Stories only matter when they are passed on. Be the one who passes this on. Subscribe to this channel if you have not already. More stories are coming. Stories of courage, of transformation, of the roads that lead us to who we are meant to be. Join us on the journey. We will see you in the next one. The screen fades to black, but the truth remains. Some people wear badges, some wear leather, some wear both. And what matters, in the end, is not the uniform. It is the heart that beats beneath it. Brotherhood never ends.